The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Constructing Your Institution's Passport Block, Perspectives from the System Level. I'm Kate Springsteen, Member Services Coordinator for Interstate Passport. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at interstatepassport.wichi.edu/webinars by tomorrow, October 19th. If you have questions throughout the webinar, type your question into the box on the GoToWebinar panel, and it will be brought to the presenter's attention. Following this webinar, I will be sending out an email with information on where to find the recording, as well as a link to a survey, which we would very much appreciate if you would fill out. I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Paul Turman. Paul is the System Vice President for Academic Affairs at the South Dakota Board of Regents. His responsibilities include oversight of the System Common Course Catalog, research and economic development, institutional research, new programs, and state scholarship programs. Paul received his PhD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and prior to joining the South Dakota Board of Regents staff, he taught as an associate professor at the University of Northern Iowa, and was recognized for outstanding teaching and service at the institutional and national levels. Throughout his academic career, Paul has published 34 peer-reviewed research articles at the national and regional levels, as well as co-authored 4 books. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining. I think we've certainly had a very good opportunity in working with WICHI here over the last 2 years to begin to fully implement the Interstate Passport here in South Dakota. And so I thought it might be useful to try to spend just a little bit of time walking those who are on the call through kind of what is unique about South Dakota and why taking a system approach worked best, some of the constraints that we ran into, as well as what are kind of the lingering steps that we have as we move forward. And I'll maybe end with just giving an overview of kind of some things to think about, the benefits of going forward as a system versus the benefits that you get as an institution moving forward on their own, and how you can leverage those two different sets against each other. So I'll like to just simply start by trying to give kind of a general overview of the South Dakota regental system. We certainly have a governing board model here in South Dakota for the oversight of our 6 four-year institutions. We are a state with no community colleges, and so in essence, I think we have a number of kind of open access institutions, along with the research comprehensive campuses. But within that environment, our board has really looked to maintain a very strong centralized model for how we deliver student services and manage and support students. So we have a common instance of a student information system. We use Colleague. And when I say common instance, it doesn't necessarily mean that each one of our institutions utilizes Colleague. It's that all of our students, all 36,000 that are served in the system at the 6 campuses, are all in the same environment collectively together. And so to manage some of the things that we have run into with transfer across our institutions, our board implemented a common course catalog where basically all courses in the regental system that are perceived to be common with another institution are managed and facilitated at the central level, basically working their way through my office here in Pierre. We also have a system general education environment where all 6 campuses have the same 6 general education goals, very similar to, I think, what a lot of states have now begun to pursue to make it easier for transfer within their state environment. And we've had something like this since about 1985, and it has had different evolutions over time. But the main thing that our board has been insistent upon is the notion that if a student has completed a gen ed, a course that meets a gen ed goal at one campus, automatically those courses will transfer to meeting that same goal at another institution. And so what we try to do in working with the provost on each one of the campuses is really manage the way in which courses are approved, how we look at those and the delivery methods that are utilized for each one of them, common descriptions, common sets of learning outcomes, so that there really is no confusion for students somewhere down the path. When the Interstate Passport began to kind of emerge as a project by WICHE, and just as a reminder, this was really something that WICHE undertook in two different phases. The first phase was something that was funded by the Carnegie Foundation, and their goal at the time was to work with interested states to bring together faculty to put together learning outcomes and proficiency criteria that could be used in common for mathematics, written communication, and oral communication. At the time when phase one was underway, I don't know that we had enough interest in our system to start to take part because of a couple of different initiatives that we were trying to finalize. But when phase two came on board to extend into the other 6 discipline areas that the LEAP Foundation and the work by AAC and U has worked to compile for about 200 institutions around the country, when the Lumina Foundation and the Gates Foundation provided funding to have faculty get together and do the same thing for those remaining 6 areas, we thought it would be a good opportunity for us to be involved at that stage. The one thing that we noted very quickly was that if only one of our campuses participated, because of this common course environment that is listed here on this slide, if a student came in to, say, South Dakota State University and then wanted to have the passport brought in and then they would transfer somewhere else in our system, automatically the passport would have to carry forward based on our current transfer policies. And so our Academic Affairs Council, made up of the provosts of those 6 campuses, agreed that this made sense for us to tackle this as a system and begin working with WICHE on this project. So it's not to say that we didn't have some resistance at different points along the way. And one of the things that I think was raised by faculty, deans, registrars, was whether or not, is transfer activity within our regional system going down? And if it's not, then why do we need to do something radically different? And so I began to kind of look at what our transfer patterns were within the regional system across these 4 different sectors, and use these data to really demonstrate that we are seeing a trend where basically each year over the 5-year period that we began to look at this, we were seeing about 100 fewer students every year transfer into the system, whether that be transferring between our own campuses, technical institutes, students within private institutions in South Dakota, or coming from external institutions outside of our state. And this does not align in any way with the typical trends that we're seeing in regional states and around the country. And so about the only thing you can point to is that something about our environment and the policies and the way we transfer in credit is causing some of this downward trend. I use these data to try to demonstrate that doing something different and engaging with the passport would be a very beneficial thing for us as a system. The other thing that they raised was, how is it that the states that we tend to have a lot of transfer students come from, are they a part of the WICHE process? And so the data didn't necessarily reinforce that we were going to be able to attract a sizable number of students from the participating states, because we aren't necessarily seeing a lot of transfers coming from the other 6 institutions that wanted to participate in phase 2 of the project. The one thing that I tried to reinforce, which I think is extremely important, is the fact that having our faculty involved in this process early on, and beginning to look at those learning outcomes, and say it's 5-10 years down the road when other states begin to come on board, that we were a significant player in the development of the various learning outcomes that are associated with all 9 of the different content areas that the passport tries to evaluate. So as we began to kind of take on this work, one of the things that I found probably most useful that different states kind of have different formations of these, whether it be a general education council in a state that's set in place by state statute, or institutions have found ways to develop their own relationships among common disciplines, is that the South Dakota Board of Regents back in about 1998 implemented what we call discipline councils, and they've taken a variety of forms. We've had as many as 12 councils, and that has then dwindled down to a smaller subset. But the goal really was to try to ensure that faculty begin to foster relationships with one another, so that when the board imposed a common course catalog environment in our state, that when a common course needed to be developed or a unique course delivered at one campus is sought to be delivered at another, that faculty have developed relationships in other capacities to help facilitate that curriculum process that normally occurs at an institutional level. And so we basically have kind of an annual engagement process with these discipline councils that they work through common challenges that they're facing. They put together common fee requests that can go to the board. Anytime new licensure requirements are emerging in given disciplines, it has given them the opportunity to have a very good cadre of faculty, 2 from each campus, who are working collectively to kind of solve problems that they all are facing. Right now, we have basically 7 different discipline councils, and most of these align quite closely with the 6 general education goals that we have in South Dakota. And I was really able to rely upon the formally established councils to do much of the work associated with phase 2 of the project, getting together, working with their colleagues, developing learning outcomes, taking those to the multi-state negotiation that occurred in Boulder, and then really trying to formalize what this complete list looks like right now. So faculty are heavily involved in this process all along. We also have opportunities any place that there's additional need. Ad hoc discipline councils can be formed, and that's what you'll see on this next slide, in that we certainly relied on, for like human cultures, that area in stage 1 of phase 2. I had my members of the Humanities Discipline Council come together, formulate their learning outcomes, send them forward to WICHE, and then they sent a representative there to Boulder to negotiate with the other states. Did the same thing for creative expression. My Fine Arts Discipline Council really did the majority of the work associated with helping us kind of move forward. For those other ones, it required the formation of a collection of faculty across institutions. But I think because of our discipline council structure, it made it very easy for them to understand what we were trying to do, because in the past, they've also been asked to help develop our specific learning outcomes for our general education requirements. When it came to phase 2 or phase 1 work that we were not involved with, I relied, for at least quantitative literacy, on the Math Discipline Council and Written Communication, our English Discipline Council, to review what had been developed. And then I put together a team from those that are engaged in our oral communication curriculum to also review those learning outcomes. I think what you'll see is that if you're a state that is interested in participating in the passport, especially at the system level, beginning to think through how you would have faculty review those learning outcomes and see if there's a strong enough alignment with the various learning outcomes you have and the goals that are embedded within your state would not be a very difficult leap for you if you have these types of council structures in place. If not, then there certainly are a variety of different opportunities that you can pursue. But I'll kind of transition to how we eventually formed our blocks, but I thought I would certainly just stop maybe to see if there's any questions about how our system is set up, how our faculty kind of work through the process of being involved in the creation of the various learning outcomes and the proficiency criteria. And then if nothing, I will move on to specifically what we did to now identify the courses that we think align with each of these 9 different content areas.
Hi, Paul. We don't have any questions at this time, But if anybody does have questions, please submit them in the questions panel on the GoToWebinar panel, and I will forward them on to Paul.
So I think one of the first things for any states that, well, it'd be a state or an institution that is interested now in participating in the passport, interstate passport moving forward, it really does require you to look at your curriculum and try to assess, which of the courses that you have seem to align with these respective learning outcomes so that you can begin to build a passport block for students. Once that passport block is put in place, it allows you to do the types of advising that you want to do for students to encourage them to take the right sets of courses so that transferability is viable. But one of the things that I find relatively unique across multiple states when I look at the general education curriculum that is in place is that these really do not vary dramatically. We have our 6 goal areas that have a set of common student learning outcomes. While they're not identical to what the WICHE Passport has developed, when I ask faculty to look closely at it, compare what we have for math with what the Interstate Passport has for quantitative literacy, the same types of general outcomes are embedded in both. And because of that, I think it was relatively easy for some faculty in these areas to establish that, yes, if the student has come from an institution that has met these learning outcomes, I don't necessarily need to be concerned about the specific course that they've completed, as long as the faculty at those institutions are affirming that the outcomes are being fulfilled. And so it really, I think, takes a very different approach in the way that transfer of credit has traditionally been envisioned within higher education systems around the country. We still function in a kind of a course-by-course equivalency, and I think that was the value that a lot of folks saw with the way in which the passport could be seen differently. We do kind of establish that only 100 and 200 level courses are viable within our general education curriculum here in the system. And so that made it relatively easy to make sure that our faculty teams were looking specifically at the 100, 200 level courses that we have available. So once we agreed that we were going to participate as a system and begin to work our way through the development of the block, really what I began to do is have our faculty groups look at those SLOs and connect those to specific courses that they felt had very similar types of learning outcomes embedded within them. And the one unique thing is that while I have referenced kind of up above that 6 goals exist, but we had to identify courses across 9, it became relevant for each one of our disciplines to not only think about the courses that traditionally fit in one goal area. So if it's natural and physical sciences, it was relatively easy for them to begin to look at how the courses are going to fit into the natural science discipline area. But I think there are also places where the content in the course also helps build student critical thinking, team building types of experiences for students. And so I asked them not only to think about their traditional content area, but also places where a course could be used to meet goals across different interdisciplinary areas. And so that's where I think we were able to build out a passport block structure that expanded our learning outcomes and our gen ed goals for the system without compromising what the faculty in our system have had in place for going on about 13 years now. And that cross blending or looking for linkages across student learning outcomes and content areas is going to be critically important. I'll give you just kind of one example, the one that was probably the most difficult for us to try to manage here in South Dakota. So we had a team that was put together to develop the SLOs for teamwork value system. But when I asked them to identify the courses that they teach that would fit with that, A lot of them had a difficult time of definitively saying that while critical thinking or teamwork is a part of that process, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing that the student is learning out of those courses. And so we ended up needing to draw from courses approved for 3 different goal areas to fill in the passport block for the teamwork and value system itself. And that ended up being that we had kind of literature and creative writing courses that emerged to meet those requirements. A number of courses in the humanities and fine arts like theater and drama, various kind of collaborative humanities courses that we have, as well as I think a number of the faculty in our natural sciences, based on the way that our lab curriculum is set up, that teamwork and value systems became an integral part of that, the way that those courses are designed. So we had to, at the very end of the day, when trying to track down which students have met at least one, have a course in each of the 9 areas, we just had to stipulate that you can't double dip. So if it counted in the area of writing or written communication and value or teamwork and value systems, you had to have at least another course in each of those 2 different areas to be able to count it, that this kind of double dipping or the double counting wouldn't work. Despite that, I think we were able to, and once our scripting was completed for our student information system, we found about 10,000 students that had met the learning outcomes connected with the 9 blocks that were identified by our faculty in the system in the creation of the overall structure for us. So the next step really was, once I think that we had a really good foundation for what our block was going to look like. The nice thing about the WICHE grant itself was that it was designed to not only do the work with faculty, but also kind of marketing and communication representatives on the campuses. What are the things that the registrars need to know, and how do they work and collaborate with the engagement on this project? We also have to have institutional researchers involved in developing the right scripting. How do we develop codes for what to assign to a student who's met the passport block and get that eventually transcripted for students? And I think most importantly, how do faculty stay involved in, when a new course comes along in our gen ed environment, they're able to filter it into the passport block, and then that gets captured as the various kind of IT processes begin to take place. But I think routinely communicating with these various stakeholders on the campus have been extremely important, because all along in this process, it's been critical to make sure that our functional groups saw what it is that we're doing, and then became invested in making sure that the solutions were there, so that a passport block just now doesn't sit off on a shelf and students aren't being encouraged to take the right courses, and that when a student leaves us, that they are able to carry that forward with them. So we also need to basically have our board needed to approve the MOU as a system with WICHE to make this viable for us to participate. We had talked about whether or not it would be good to just have each institution have their president review it and sign it. But in the end, I think we agreed, because of the approach that we took as a system, that it would be good to have our executive director, or the equivalent of chancellors in other systems, be the final signature on these. All along this process, almost every board meeting or every other board meeting, I had taken them updates about the status of the project, all the decision points, where we were involved as this initiative really unfolded, how much our faculty were really engaged in the creation of these passport blocks. While I did get pushback at times, I think the feedback and the surveys we did with our faculty created an evolution in the process over time that allowed for certainly much stronger buy-in. I think what our board really recognized was some of the data that I presented earlier, in that, we see some potential benefits here of growing our enrollment and having a process in place that really is student-centric, that it's changing kind of the way that we've normally tried to approach transfer, And because of our involvement in the WICHE Passport, we've actually created a passport or a transfer block component embedded within our own transfer policy for students that come from institutions that we get a lot of students from that are not typical articulation agreements at the program to program level. And so the one critical piece that we built into this process was that our board was signing off on the principle about the transfer blocks as proposed, but it still gives us the flexibility within the Academic Affairs Council and the people I have engaged in this process to make modifications to that as needed over time. And so I don't have to take it back to the board and get their approval every time a course gets dropped off or added to our passport block. And I think that's extremely important when you consider how much sometimes governing and coordinating boards need to be involved in the process. This is one of those small kind of elements of minutia that I don't know that you need their ongoing signature authority on every time. So one of the things I thought would be maybe useful is to just give you some perspective on both benefits that you get out of taking a system approach, and then I would say maybe the challenges that I've faced in leading this effort over the last 2 years. That there are times where I've kind of wandered more to, boy, this would have been a lot easier, or I wouldn't have run into this if we'd had our institutions take the lead and really do all of this work. But Kate, maybe before I jump into that, I'll see if there's any questions. If not, I'll keep kind of moving.
Thanks for breaking, Paul. We actually don't have any questions right now, but we might get some more in before the end of this.
Okay. So when it comes to system benefits or state level benefits, if you're having institutions collectively one-on-one go through and build their passport blocks, I think the opportunity for movement within institutions and places where you have a lot of swirling activity for your students, where they may start at one campus, show up at another, and they complete the passport block at their second institution, but none of their courses at the first institution are being counted because a lot of what it's set up to do is count the credit hours that are allocated at your particular campus. And so system perspective, I've always contended that by doing things collectively together and agreeing, even though it takes a little bit more work of getting faculty across campuses to really generate a consensus on the approach that you're taking, it is always going to be better for students than it will if you try to do it at the campus by campus approach. The second one is, I certainly think that throughout this process, we really developed more of an efficient model, in that sometimes system offices or kind of state coordinating groups are going to eliminate a lot of the duplication of effort that occurs on an institution when tackling this. And I would say this has certainly been the case on the IT side. So for all 6 of our campuses to develop different scripting to go in and be able to identify at the given end of a term when a student has met all of the requirements of the block or not, or they still have one left, and how do I communicate with them? Having all of our campuses do that in our common instance just did not make a lot of sense. And so there are times where this was probably some of the biggest hurdles to get through, but at the very end of the day, I think we were able to, I think, hone in a smaller subset of people and reduce a lot of the effort that would have occurred had we had each campus move forward on their own. I think the other thing is, and one of the most important things as I look at some of the other states that are a part of phase 2 of this project, was that as new institutional leadership kind of came into the fold, we almost saw like a falling back or falling behind in the progression that had been made. I think the fact that I've been in the system office now for 12 years, I was here the first time we ever discussed passport. Every time I've had a new provost come in, it's not a question about, are we as an institution still going to participate? It's that as a system, this is the approach that we've chosen to take, and new leadership is not going to change that. So I have had, since we started this project, I think I still only have one of the 6 provosts that was here when we were first approached by WICHE to participate. And I think we'd have been certainly in a very different place if each one of our campuses with new leadership were asked to kind of take on these efforts. I do think, though, that there are certainly some benefits at the institutional level. And, you know, there are times I don't know that I have all of the campus ownership. I certainly have the campus buy-in, but a lot of times I think they look to me or people in my office to help kind of whatever the next task is or the next step is. It always kind of comes back to, well, this was a system project. So you must be, as a system, the one who's going to take on that next component of keeping this viable. And it's, as we get to the point of having to upload data on each one of our campuses to the National Student Clearinghouse, or doing anything about here's a cost of doing a customization so we can batch load these into our environment. I think by default, those things end up coming back to my office more than they probably should. And I needed to have maybe thought through this more aggressively early on about how do I keep the campuses constantly engaged in knowing that once the MOU is signed, the work really is theirs to move forward. I think there's also some benefits of, the one thing that I've struggled with the most is trying to develop a system marketing or messaging strategy, and that campuses really focus things just so different when it comes to either recruitment or the way they like to work with their individual students about where they're at in the completion of either gen ed, it would be this passport, or various kind of degree components that they have. And so I still think that the campuses need the flexibility to do that in the way that they want. And then I think just at the very end, kind of the way they track and the way that they report, a lot of these different elements does need to really reside at the institutional level. And that I've taken on the work of both tracking and then reporting to the National Student Clearinghouse, but I know within a few years we need to be able to shepherd that along, because it's not that difficult for me to report. I have to go in, log in, or have my IR director log in 6 different times to submit the data to the National Student Clearinghouse. But if you're at a system that you're not the IPEDS key holder and you're not used to doing that, and you have 10 to 20 different institutions that are participating, then these kind of final follow-through things are extremely important for the campuses to be responsible for. In closing here, I thought it might just be relevant to maybe talk a little bit about some just kind of generic guidance from the system approach. I think it's important, if you're trying to make the decision to participate in the WICHE Passport, to maybe start where I did, with kind of looking at your transfer patterns. What seems to be happening across your state at particular institutions? Because I think those same types of questions are going to come up. We seem to get a lot of transfers now. Why would we want to do this? Because it can go both ways. We not only may attract more students, but does this project allow a student to want to, or easier for them to leave us and transfer to another institution? Those people who fully understand kind of the decision points that come into play when a student is deciding to transfer, I think when they're making that choice, whether you've made the pathway easy or hard, oftentimes is not going to deter that next step for them. I would also suggest that having your faculty be engaged as early on in this process as possible is critically important. You know, they're going to want to look at those learning outcomes. They're going to want to make sure that the authority that they have traditionally had for reviewing courses isn't going to completely go away. It's just accepting transfer at a more kind of surface level versus the granular level that they've been engaged in currently. I also think that the better that the more you can go in and evaluate how the interstate passport aligns with your current gen ed structure in the state, and laying that out for folks in advance or the first time you begin to have these conversations so that they can see the similarity that exists. I mean, we had just gone through a comprehensive redesign of our gen ed while we were engaged in the WICHE passport. And as I noted earlier, as I look at other states around us and in the country, you know, people do not vary that radically. And so many different institutions and faculty have kind of bought into the LEAP framework. And because this is really built on that foundation, I think it will be easy for people to see the connection, but you have to sometimes maybe spell that out a little bit more for them. One important thing that I think had the potential of unraveling our participation in the passport was this notion about prerequisites. And sometimes you have to dig down into the documentation from WICHE to see where kind of these implications come into play. Our mathematicians were extremely concerned about accepting the passport block for quantitative literacy if that meant that a student would then come in and have other prerequisite or courses that they would have to complete where mathematics was an established prerequisite. And so it does not cover all the prerequisite requirements that normally exist for transfer. So if you had Math 102, but you needed to then go on to Calc 2 and Math or Calculus 1 was required, well, then when the student comes in, they're still going to have to take those prerequisite courses as established. Or if there is a good alignment, the student took Calculus 1, then the faculty still have the opportunity to verify that those courses are meeting the same requirements that they would on a course-by-course transfer before they're allowed to advance into those upper division courses. The last one is that, you know, I think it's great to see a number of kind of our regional states participating in this conversation today because we're growing interest. But I think you get a broader perspective and engagement if you're finding ways to look around your region. How do you get the states that are adjacent to you to also see that the passport might be a very viable model for us to begin to pursue more aggressively in higher ed? I know that's the work that we're doing. While I had showed the slide with Wyoming on it earlier, and while we get a number of students from Wyoming, it's when I go east that the Minnesotas, the Iowas, and the Nebraskas, the more those types of states are interested in participating in the passport, the more viable that this becomes. And I think it grows the kind of footprint for how students can use this successfully to move between institutions and not have to replicate general education requirements that oftentimes are just such a significant barrier to students. But those really were the types of insights that I thought it'd be worthwhile trying to share with those on the webinar today. But I certainly would be happy to answer any questions on anything I talked about or other topics or issues that you had hoped I would address during my discussion.
Thanks, Paul. We do have a couple of questions. The first question is, how would courses in the passport block get updated? Would you have to reconvene the original teams?
I believe that I would, you know, if all those team members are around, I would certainly reconvene those teams and ask for their insight. A lot of times I think what it would be is one campus would be requesting to add a course to it, and I would just work with my teams again to make sure that they're comfortable with that addition. So I think we started with a relatively small block, knowing that it will continue to grow over time. And I also limited it to just our gen ed courses. I think some point in the future, we're going to see kind of discipline-specific courses that people look at these learning outcomes and begin to expand into, and we just haven't opened it up for that yet.
Thanks. The second question I have is, once you had the passport block in place, how did you engage the registrars to ensure that the passport showed up on students' transcripts?
Well, I mean, not that far removed, and we have very similar kind of functional groups. I mean, in just the same way faculty work together, the registrars on all 6 of our campuses have regularly scheduled meetings. And I began to, when it looked like the passport block was going to get approved, I began to lay this out and get feedback from them about what's the best mechanism to help ensure that this is put on there. What are the things I can do in my position to give you the leverage that you need? And I think the hardest part was, I think they saw the benefit of it, but their preference would be that we need a batch process for the number of students that we're going to be assigning this to. So not only did we develop scripting to run a report at the end of every term, then once that report is run, we're finalizing the batch upload into the transcript using a pseudo course, which was, I took their guidance on what's the best way to assign this. They have a pseudo course that's automatically batch loaded into the transcript with the passport block designation. And then that then triggers a communication out to the students that they have successfully completed the course, or the course is required. And if they have questions about what that means, here's the individual at their campus to talk to.
Thanks. That was the last question that I have, but if you do have any other questions, please feel free to type them in, or you can also contact either myself or Paul, and I'll be sending out an email in a little bit, so you'll have my contact information on there. All right. Well, thanks, Paul, for this great presentation. And again, feel free to contact us with any other questions, or visit us at our website at interstatepassport.wichita.edu.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for everyone that joined this afternoon.